I paid $42,000 for that flight. And yet, when the silver dome lid lifted from my plate, I was staring at someone else's half-eaten meal. The bread was torn. The chicken breast was missing a corner. Teeth marks still visible on the edge. Even the fork on the side carried a smear of sauce that didn't match what I'd ordered. The hum of the engines faded into the background as my eyes locked on the plate. It wasn't just food. It was a message, a reminder that money doesn't buy you respect when they've already decided you don't deserve it. I set the fork down, letting the silence stretch. One flight attendant glanced away. Another smirked like I was being dramatic. My voice, when it came, was low and even. "Whose plate is this?" No one answered. Somewhere in the cabin, I heard someone chuckle. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. Instead, I glanced at the clock on the wall. 7 minutes. That's all I was going to give them. By the time the second hand completed its loop, 3 people on that aircraft no longer had a job. And that was only the beginning. If you're new here, welcome to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Hit subscribe so you never miss true human stories like this one, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know. I wasn't born into wealth. My earliest memories are of my mother, still in her classroom dress, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of graded papers on one side and overdue bills on the other. She was a school teacher, the kind who knew the names of every child in her care, even the ones who made her job harder. My father had been gone since I was 6, so it was just the 2 of us in a small apartment where the heating cut out in winter and the ceiling fan rattled in the summer. The only thing we had in abundance was expectation. My mother believed that if I worked twice as hard, I could stand in any room and demand to be heard. What she didn't say, but I learned, was that working twice as hard still wouldn't make some people see me as equal. At 29, I founded my first AI startup with 2 friends from graduate school. We slept in the office, built our own servers, and pitched to investors who thought my role was community outreach instead of CEO. By 42, I'd taken my company public. Billionaire, they called me in the papers. A visionary. And yet, I've been followed in luxury stores, questioned at first-class check-ins, and once asked by a valet if I really owned the car I was driving. That flight to Zurich wasn't a vacation. It was the last step in closing a $1.2 billion acquisition, a deal that could bring my technology to entire continents still overlooked by the industry. My board had insisted on the private charter, not because I cared for extravagance, but because it guaranteed confidentiality and efficiency. Every hour mattered. Every conversation had to stay secure. From the moment I arrived at the private terminal that morning, I noticed the difference. The welcome wasn't warm. It was procedural. My name was spoken like it didn't belong on their manifest. The woman at the counter handed me my boarding pass without making eye contact, as if she'd rather not look at me at all. I told myself to focus on the work ahead. I'd learned to swallow moments like that. Brief, cutting, but survivable. But there's a difference between subtle disrespect and public humiliation. When I stepped aboard that jet, I was stepping into a space that was supposed to be mine for the next 12 hours. A space I'd paid for in full. A space where the crew's job was to ensure my comfort so I could focus on sealing one of the largest deals of my career. Instead, they made it clear, in ways both small and unmistakable, that I was not who they expected to serve. That my presence in that cabin disrupted the picture they had in their heads of who belongs in a seat like mine. And when that plate of food arrived, I realized this was no accident. The private terminal was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, charter staff greeted me with warm smiles and a subtle air of competition, each trying to prove their service was worth the astronomical fees I paid. This time, the woman at the front desk didn't smile at all. Her voice was flat, almost bored, as she confirmed by name. My passport lay on the counter longer than necessary before she picked it up. She didn't ask about my trip, didn't offer the usual pre-boarding refreshments. Instead, she pushed the boarding pass toward me without looking up, her fingers pulling away as though she'd been forced to touch something she didn't want to. I wheeled my own carry-on toward the lounge. 2 ground staff walked past without acknowledging me, but when a white man in a suit entered a few moments later, they greeted him with cheerful voices. He hadn't even reached the counter before they were asking if he needed anything to drink. I've learned to read these shifts. They're small, easy to brush off if you've never been on the receiving end, but they pile up fast. You start to feel the difference in tone, in how your presence seems to rearrange the air in a room. Boarding began shortly after. My luggage was taken by a man who didn't say a word, just grabbed the handle with a sharp tug that nearly pulled the bag from my grip. I caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes, like I was inconveniencing him by letting him do his job. He didn't offer to take my coat or show me to my seat. On board, I stepped into my private suite. It should have been a sanctuary: leather seats, a small dining table, and the quiet hum of a space meant for work and rest. Instead, it felt unwelcoming. No preset drink, no neatly folded blanket on the seat, just empty surfaces and silence. A flight attendant appeared a few minutes later. Her expression was neutral, but her tone clipped, as if every word cost her more effort than it was worth. "Would you like to order now, or?" "No welcome. No offer of the day's specials." I requested a light lunch, something simple to keep me focused before a meeting I'd scheduled mid-flight with my legal team. She jotted it down without repeating it back and left. I checked the time. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At the half-hour mark, I glanced down the aisle. The curtain to the galley was half closed, but I could hear muffled conversation and laughter. No one came in to update me on my order. I busied myself reviewing contract terms on my tablet, telling myself not to let irritation take hold. But the longer the delay, the harder it was to shake the thought that I'd been quietly deprioritized. Service on charters is rarely slow, especially not for someone paying what I was paying. When the curtain finally shifted, it was another attendant, not the one who had taken my order. She carried a tray, the kind usually used for reheated meals, not freshly plated dishes. She set it down in front of me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The first thing I noticed wasn't the food, it was the fork. It already had sauce on it. A dark streak that clung to the prongs, thickened like it had been sitting for a while. I looked at the plate. The bread roll had a piece missing, edges jagged where teeth had bitten into it. The chicken breast was smaller than the portion I knew they served on this route, one corner torn away. The salad greens were wilted at the edges, the kind of limp that comes from being picked over and set aside. I glanced back up at her. "This isn't fresh," I said evenly. She gave a half shrug. "It's the same as what we're serving in the main cabin. It's fine." It wasn't fine. It was deliberate, and the smirk that tugged at the corner of her mouth before she turned away told me she knew exactly what she'd done. The food was no longer the point. It was the message. The bread roll was the first thing I saw clearly. A small, clean bite mark cutting into the crust, the jagged tear revealing soft white bread inside. No knife marks, no serving tongs, just teeth. The chicken breast sat beside it, the top half missing entirely. The edge wasn't neatly sliced, it was ragged, torn away. A shallow pool of sauce had formed on the plate, darker where it had dried and crusted around the rim. I'd eaten in too many boardrooms, hotel lounges, and first-class cabins to mistake this for fresh service. This was someone's unfinished plate, replated and passed off to me like I wouldn't notice. I set the fork down without touching the food. "This isn't mine," I said evenly, keeping my voice calm. The flight attendant, still standing beside me, glanced down at the plate and then back at me. "It's the same as what we serve everyone," she replied, her tone flat, almost bored. Everyone? I thought about the untouched tables in the other private suites on board. I thought about how often everyone somehow never included the people who looked like me. I leaned back in my seat. "Where did this come from?" I asked. She shrugged lightly, as if the question didn't deserve an answer. From behind me, another voice spoke, low enough that it wasn't meant for me to hear, but close enough that I caught every word. "She should be grateful we're serving her at all." The words hit like a stone dropped into still water. Grateful. For half-eaten bread and second-hand chicken, for service I'd paid more for than some people's yearly rent. I turned my head just enough to see the other attendant walking away. No apology, no eye contact. My mother's voice echoed in my mind from years ago. Some people will decide who you are before you even speak. Don't let them decide what you'll accept. I looked back at the plate. This wasn't about a bad meal. This was about being reminded, subtly but with intent, that I didn't belong in the seat I was in, not in their eyes. For a moment, I considered saying nothing, just documenting the incident, forwarding it to my assistant, and letting the legal team handle it after landing. That's what the old me might have done. Take the insult, turn it into paperwork, and move on. But my silence wouldn't erase what just happened. It wouldn't stop them from doing it to someone else tomorrow. And I could feel it, the quiet anticipation from the crew that I'd swallow it, pretend it didn't happen, and prove them right. I straightened in my seat. My voice, when I spoke, was measured, deliberate. Tell your captain I'll need to speak with him. Now. The attendant's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she lingered, as if weighing whether to argue. I didn't break eye contact. Eventually, she walked away. I glanced at the clock on the wall above my suite's entryway. My watch, synced perfectly, showed the same time. I had a meeting in 2 hours. I had a deal worth over $1 billion waiting on my signature. And I had exactly 7 minutes before I decided what would happen next on this aircraft. 7 minutes to decide if this would be handled quietly, or if I'd make sure every person responsible left this plane unemployed. I folded my hands on the table, the untouched plate still sitting between them, and waited. 7 minutes. That's how long I decided this would take. Not to eat. God knows I wasn't touching that plate, but to shift the balance in this cabin so completely that everyone would remember exactly why I was not to be treated like this. I stared at the untouched food in front of me. The humiliation was still there, lingering like a bad taste in my mouth, but anger had no place in what I was about to do. This wasn't about emotion, it was about respect, mine, and the message that some lines can't be crossed without consequence. My mother used to tell me that silence can be louder than shouting, and in my world, silence paired with decisive action is deafening. I pressed the button on my watch, starting the countdown. 7 minutes, not a second more. Reaching into my leather portfolio, I pulled out the sat phone that had been included as part of the jet's executive suite amenities. I dialed a direct number, not the customer service line, not some general switchboard. The man who answered was the flight operations manager for the entire charter company, a name I'd memorized after my assistant booked this aircraft. Operations. This is Hartman. This is Passenger Monroe on flight AXT 742. I want you to note the time. I gave him the exact minute and second from my synced watch. From this moment, you have 7 minutes to address a breach of contract and a discriminatory incident on board your aircraft. There was a pause on the other end. Can you clarify? Oh, I can do more than clarify, I said evenly. I can detail exactly how my meal service was replaced with partially consumed food, which is both a health code violation and a direct violation of your own premium charter terms. I can also detail the comments made by your crew, one in my presence, another within earshot, implying that I should be grateful to be served at all. I can provide names, descriptions, and the times these incidents occurred. Do you need me to go on? No, ma'am, he said quickly, voice tightening. I'll make some calls. You won't make some calls, you'll correct this before the clock hits 0. After that, I escalate to your CEO, your board, and every regulator who oversees this industry. And Hartman, yes, you should also know the person you're speaking to controls a pending $1.2 billion acquisition deal involving your company's largest international partner. Now tell me, do you think your shareholders would enjoy reading about this in tomorrow's financial press? The line went quiet for a beat. Then, understood. Please remain in your suite. I ended the call without another word. 5 minutes, 42 seconds remaining. I leaned back, hands folded, and listened. Somewhere beyond my door, a headset crackled. A muffled voice, authoritative, urgent, spoke fast. The curtain to the galley whipped open and shut, shoes scuffed against the carpet. When the lead attendant passed my suite, her posture had changed. Gone was the casual smirk from earlier. Her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't stop, didn't meet my gaze. Across the aisle, one of the male crew members glanced in, quickly looked away, then muttered something to a colleague. She shook her head sharply, lips pressed thin. 4 minutes, 21 seconds remaining. The captain's voice came over the intercom, not the usual calm, rehearsed tone, but clipped, almost strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief operational adjustment. Please remain seated while we coordinate with ground support. An operational adjustment mid-flight on a clear weather route? It was as good as an announcement to the crew that something serious was in motion. In the galley, voices rose. I caught fragments. Call from ops? No now. She said what? 3 minutes 10 seconds remaining. I saw the first signs of real panic. One attendant's hand trembled as she refilled a passenger's glass. Another disappeared into the crew quarters and didn't come back. The cabin energy had shifted. No more laughter from behind the curtain, no more lazy indifference. The air was tight with the knowledge that whatever this was, it had reached the top and the fallout was already on its way down. 2 minutes, 24 seconds remaining. A discreet chime at my suite door. The captain himself stood there, hat in hand, eyes flicking briefly to the offending plate, still sitting untouched on my table. His voice was quiet, controlled. Ms. Monroe, I've been informed of a situation. I want you to know it's being addressed immediately. It's already being addressed, I said, not raising my voice. I'll let you know when it's resolved. He nodded once, stepped back, and disappeared toward the front of the aircraft. 1 minute, 12 seconds remaining. From the galley, the sound of a zipper. Luggage being pulled out. Rapid footsteps toward the crew service door. The faint click of a latch, disengaging. 39 seconds. A voice crackled through the intercom. Not for passengers, but for crew only. Short, clipped instructions. No one in the cabin moved except for the 3 crew members I'd named to Hartman. They walked past me in silence, eyes fixed on the floor, each carrying a small roller bag. 7 minutes exactly. The service door sealed behind them, and the cabin was quiet. The captain returned to my suite, hat still in hand. His face looked as though the weight of the entire company had landed on his shoulders somewhere between the cockpit and my door. The matter is being handled, he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I didn't look up from the contract draft on my tablet. It already has been, I replied. For a moment he stood there, uncertain, before nodding once and stepping back. I heard the soft click of the suite door closing, then the muted sounds of movement beyond the walls. The cabin wasn't buzzing anymore, it was holding its breath. Through the narrow gap of my suite's sliding door, I caught a glimpse of the 3 crew members I'd named. They walked down the aisle in single file, each dragging a small bag. No eye contact, no words, just the hollow shuffle of people who understood exactly why their journey had ended mid-flight. We were descending. The captain came over the PA to announce a brief operational stop in Reykjavik for crew changes. He didn't elaborate, but anyone paying attention could feel that this was no routine adjustment. The landing was smooth, almost too smooth, as if the aircraft itself was trying not to disturb the tense quiet that had settled inside. The door opened, and a set of mobile stairs rolled into place. 2 ground personnel boarded quickly, speaking in low voices to the captain before turning to escort the 3 attendants off. No one clapped. No one whispered. The only sound was the faint rush of cold Icelandic air entering the cabin as the door remained open just long enough for them to disappear down the steps. Minutes later, replacements boarded. A fresh-faced trio who moved with quiet professionalism. One offered me a genuine smile and a glass of water without being prompted. The contrast was jarring. I sipped slowly, watching the last of the commotion fade into the background. The original crew had tried to humiliate me in a space I'd paid for, in an industry where appearances and treatment often dictate perception. They'd wanted me to feel small. Instead, they were now walking across a cold tarmac, stripped of the very authority they'd used to demean me. The captain's voice returned over the PA as we prepared for takeoff again. "We thank you for your patience," he said, each word measured. But his eyes, when they flicked toward my suite as he passed, carried something more than gratitude, something closer to caution. As the engines roared back to life, I leaned back in my seat, feeling the shift. The remaining crew moved through the cabin with a deliberate politeness, careful to maintain distance, yet attentive to every request. They knew the story of what had just happened wouldn't stay at 40,000 feet. In their silence, I heard what I'd come to expect in moments like this. Respect, born not from fear, but from the realization that my place here was not theirs to grant or deny. We touched down in Zurich, just after sunrise. I'd planned to go straight to my hotel, review the final acquisition documents, and step into a day defined by business, not by the events of a flight. But the story had already left the cabin. By the time the wheels hit the tarmac, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Screenshots of tweets were coming in faster than I could open them. One image, grainy, clearly taken from a passenger's phone, showed the 3 crew members being escorted down the mobile stairs in Reykjavik, heads bowed against the wind. The caption read, "Black CEO fires jet crew mid-flight after alleged racist incident." It took less than an hour for the headline to trend. By the time I was in the car to my hotel, it was on the front page of business news feeds and entertainment gossip blogs alike. Some praised me as a trailblazer, a leader who refused to tolerate disrespect. Others, predictably, framed it differently, calling me too emotional, difficult, or a diva with a god complex. Those words didn't surprise me. When you're a black woman in power, standing up for yourself is rarely seen as strength by those who've never had to fight for dignity. It's labeled as aggression, arrogance, or fragility, anything but justified. My peers in the industry were split. A venture capitalist I'd known for years texted me, "You just made sure no one will ever test you in a boardroom again." Minutes later, another executive sent, "Careful, Alyssa, this will stick to you." But the thing about incidents like this is they stick whether you act or not. The only difference is whether they stick to you as someone who stayed quiet or as someone who made it impossible to repeat. By the time I reached the hotel, my assistant had forwarded me a message marked urgent from the airline's parent company CEO. It was a long, polished apology, the kind that had been run through multiple legal teams before it ever reached my inbox. They expressed deep regret, claimed zero tolerance for discrimination, and offered a generous settlement for the inconvenience. The sum was impressive if this were about money. But I hadn't lost money on that flight. I'd lost time, and they'd tried to strip me of dignity in a space I had paid for in full. I typed a brief response. "I decline your offer. I don't need compensation. I need accountability." I hit send. Within hours, the airline announced an internal investigation. The PR statement was sterile, speaking of training and reinforcement of company values. But behind closed doors, my sources told me, their partners were livid. This wasn't just bad press. It was a direct threat to the $1.2 billion acquisition I was about to close, because one of their key stakeholders was also a major shareholder in my company, and those stakeholders were already asking questions. How could they entrust expansion into African and Caribbean markets to an airline whose premium staff openly disrespected one of the very leaders driving that expansion? That night, I sat by the window in my suite, watching the city lights ripple across Lake Zurich. My phone buzzed again, this time a direct message from a young woman I'd never met. "I work as cabin crew. I've seen this happen to passengers of color more times than I can count. We're told to keep quiet. Thank you for not keeping quiet." I read it twice before setting the phone down. That was the thing about incidents like this. They weren't isolated. They were patterns, so ingrained in certain spaces that the people upholding them didn't even see them as wrong. The offer from the airline sat in my inbox for another day before I deleted it entirely. Money wouldn't erase what they'd done, and it certainly wouldn't erase the thought that they might have done it to someone else who didn't have the power to push back. If they wanted this to go away quietly, they'd chosen the wrong passenger. This was never about a plate of food. It was about dignity, about being reminded, even at 40,000 feet, that some people will always see you as less than what you are. I've learned over the years that racism doesn't always come with slurs or shouting. Sometimes it hides behind a smile, or a shrug, or the kind of service error that no one in power ever bothers to correct, because they don't see it as worth correcting. What happened on that jet wasn't an accident. No one accidentally serves a billionaire a plate someone else has already eaten from. No one accidentally mutters that I should be grateful for the privilege of being served at all. That wasn't a lapse in training. It was a reflection of what they believed to be true about me. And here's the truth that will make some people uncomfortable. No amount of success, no title, no net worth will ever fully shield you from racism. I've built a billion-dollar company, signed contracts with governments, and led teams across continents. And still, I can be reduced, in someone else's mind, to a seat I don't deserve, a service I should accept without complaint. I thought about my mother that day. I was 9 years old when we went to a diner after church. We sat at a corner booth, and I watched as 3 tables of white customers who came in after us were served first. My mother sat straight-backed, hands folded on the table, not saying a word. When I whispered to her that we'd been skipped, she only smiled faintly and said, "Eat slow, baby. They can't rush us if we're not eating." Our food came cold. No apology, no explanation. Just a quiet reminder of where we stood in that space. That same quiet humiliation was what I felt on that flight. Not because I didn't know my worth, but because I could see so clearly that they didn't care to see it. Some people will tell you to ignore it, to keep the peace, to rise above. But rising above doesn't mean staying silent. Sometimes, rising above means standing so firmly in your place that you make it impossible for someone to push you out of it again. That's why I acted. Not because of the bread roll or the chicken, but because there's a long history of people like me being told to swallow insults in the name of being professional. I've swallowed enough. The plate was just the messenger. The real problem was the message, and I decided to send one back. I've learned that raising your voice isn't the only way to be heard. I don't raise my voice anymore, I said to a reporter later that week. I raise consequences. When the wheels touched down and the cabin door opened, I stepped into the light without hesitation. Cameras were already there, some official, some in the hands of curious onlookers who'd heard whispers of what happened mid-flight. Flashes burst as I walked down the steps, each one capturing a moment I wanted the world to remember. Head high, shoulders back, not a hint of apology in my stride. This wasn't about making a scene. It was about making a stand. I moved through the terminal as people turned to watch. Some nodded in quiet recognition, others whispered, unsure if the story they'd heard was true. But I didn't slow my pace. My story wasn't for their approval. It was for anyone who's ever been told to accept less than they deserve and keep quiet about it. The airline could issue all the statements they wanted. They could promise training, oversight, reform, but they couldn't erase the truth. When they tried to make me smaller, I made sure they left lighter. 3 people lighter. If you've ever seen dignity dismissed like it was disposable, share your story below. Tell me where you're watching from, because I know this happens everywhere, and it needs to be spoken about everywhere. And if you believe silence is never an option, subscribe for more Echoes of Hope stories, because some things can only change when we decide that being quiet is no longer part of the job description.